And Churchill said, well, I have an idea. We could go into North Africa. Now, George Marshall thought from the beginning, this is going to be a black hole. This is going to suck resources in. We'll never get out of this. And in that respect, he was right. But Churchill was right, too, because what North Africa proved was that going into France in 1943 would almost certainly have been disastrous. We were not ready in 1943. So who won the argument? I guess Churchill wins it by allowing North Africa to demonstrate to skeptical Americans, we can't do this right now.
We're talking about Eisenhower, and actually he wrote probably the best memoir of any of our presidents.
Grant.
I was going to say, I was just thinking of Marszalek and Grant. And Grant,
Marszalek was president? I didn't know that.
Yes, he was.
Okay.
Asked him. So Grant and Eisenhower, of all the presidents, strangely enough, the finest memoirs, truly. And we have here three of the four who wrote out of the war. Doug MacArthur, who doesn't really get into this book at all, or very little. Bradley, who of course did. And Eisenhower. These are all the limited editions. And it's a wonderful collection to try to put all these together from World War II, because you really get an interesting feel of what they wanted us to know, like we do when we look at Sherman or Sheridan or Grant as well.
Right.
So how in heaven's name did Grant get that precipitous rise? He was an untested...
You're talking about Eisenhower.
Eisenhower, right? What did I say?
See, Grant, Eisenhower...
Oh, my, the 19th century shop here, trying to stay even in the 20th century, let alone the 21st. So, yes, Eisenhower.
Had that swift rise to command.
He was an untested brigadier general. He had drafted the...
And a brand new brigadier. He was
command.
a colonel when the war starts.
Yeah.
Colonel when the war starts. And he has 5 stars by the time it ends.
They put him up as...
Now, who else can we think of who was a mere captain when the war started and ended up with 4 stars at the end of the war?
Did I say his name by chance?
You did. Eisenhower's rise to power is fascinating because, among other things, and unlike Grant, he had never heard a shot fired in anger. He had never been in a war. He spent the entire World War I training tank companies at a place called, what was the name of that place in Pennsylvania? Gettysburg.
I remember that place.
You remember that place. And so a lot of people were skeptical. Here is a man whose great gifts are writing brilliant memos. He does excellent staff work. He could put up with Douglas MacArthur, whose aide-de-camp he was in the 20s and 30s. I mean, that's a job. Who can survive that? So his skills are essentially political. His skills are essentially academic, if you would, which is why he can write an excellent, brilliant memoir. But people weren't quite sure that his expertise tended also to military leadership in the most important operation, arguably, in the history of mankind. But that was exactly the skill needed, because not only was it a combined operation of British and Americans, it was a joint operation of land, sea, and air, and bringing all those elements together and coordinating all of them and making nobody mad at each other or yourself. That's a political job, and he did it brilliantly.
You know, over my shoulder here, I have him as presidential nominee going at it, and with Stevenson. And I've asked this question about this. Maybe this is a moment I'm going to ask you as well. But maybe you've already answered it a bit as far as Ike is concerned. What are the difficulties of a military man becoming a politician versus a politician having to become commander-in-chief?
Well, I think it depends on what your gifts and skills are. As I tried to suggest, I think Eisenhower's skills were fundamentally political. Anyway, that being a professional lifelong soldier in the Army is a political undertaking. You have to stroke egos, you have to impose discipline, but in a way that doesn't annoy people particularly. I mean, it is a political undertaking.
I asked Wesley Clark when he sat here about that, and he said, there's no politics in the Army.
Well, politics and being politically skilled are two different things. Yeah. Politics implies that it's old boyism and cronyism, and there's not a lot of that, although, sorry, General Clark, there is a little of that. But generally speaking, having political skills, the ability to bring people together, the ability to find the middle ground, the ability to express things in language that two sides will accept, those are political skills. It doesn't mean that you're deal making like a Chicago war dealer. Nothing against Chicago.
We're war dealers.
But or war dealers.
I'm here living here.
Okay, all right. I'm going to try to be good now. But those were the skills that he had. And you can have good military skills and be an unsuccessful political person. You can have good political skills and be a terribly unsuccessful military person. Benjamin Butler comes to mind. I think he was a brilliant politician, and some of the political skills that he brought with him to the war were useful. The designation of contrabands of war and other things were real contributions to the war, but God knows he couldn't run a campaign. So the skills are different. But at this level, where you're talking about combined and joint operations, it's political skills that make the whole thing work. And I don't know, I know for a fact that Montgomery could not have done it. Mm-hmm. But Eisenhower could and did. George Marshall, I think, could have done it. But Franklin Roosevelt wouldn't let him go.
What about politicians who become commander-in-chief? Is that a problem?
Politicians becoming constitutional commanders-in-chief, as Lincoln and Truman and Roosevelt and others. Again, I think at that level, those are political skills. You have to be smart enough to let military experts make military decisions, but you have to also be savvy enough to guide them in that decision-making process to know what's possible. Yeah. Because you're connecting not only the decision-making at the strategic level, but also what your allies will tolerate and what the logistical program will sustain. And that's more than just moving boxes on a map.
You go into so much detail and so much interesting detail in a readable fashion. This is a terrific book, people. The chain of command. Briefly, what was that chain of command? Because it was British versus, there's a political problem.
Yeah, there's the whole who's going to command. I mean, this is big. Remember, up until early 1944, the British have more soldiers in uniform than the United States, even though they have a population barely less than a quarter that of the United States, because they've been in it longer. Ours are still in the pipeline coming through. Eventually, by 1944, by the time of D-Day, there will be more Americans in uniform than British. And given that, Churchill, again, no slouch as a politician, Churchill figures out, well, now that the Americans are going to be the more numerous force, and the Americans are supplying something like 80% of the materiel, the ships, the tanks, the planes, the fuel, the beans, the bullets, all of this stuff, it's wise of me to go to Franklin Roosevelt and say, as he did, I think an American should command. Mm-hmm. And when he said that, he assumed, as everyone else did, that would be George C. Marshall. So did Marshall. Yeah. But then, as time went on, Roosevelt kind of thought, I really don't want to let Marshall away. I want to keep him here running the war so that somebody else can run the invasion. And that's how it ended up with Eisenhower, an American. So an American is at the top. But all three of the service commanders, land, sea, and air, they're all British. Mm-hmm. Well, there's politics right there. And then under them are more Americans, British and Americans. Americans commanding the American forces, British commanding the British forces. That's where Omar Bradley and Admiral Kirk and some of those people come in. But they are subordinate to a British type commander who is subordinate to an American overall commander. And that's a tough thing to hold together.
You talk about mobilization, and you, in a footnote, you state that the overall level of American mobilization was far less than the British, Russians, or Germans.
Right. Now,
part of that, of course, is on any effect that that had?
Well, there are several reasons why. One is we simply have more. It's our resources, our assets, our almost endless cornucopia of the ability to produce material. We put 16.5 million people into uniform before the war was over. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of them are still in the pipeline, but there's only a couple of million, like it's a small number. But as a percentage of those involved, the Russians, the Germans, the British, much more so. We put, quote me in the numbers here, I believe it's 97 active service divisions, and that includes 4 Marine Corps divisions in the field. Now, it's a lot of people, 97 divisions. But the Germans had 260 divisions when they invaded Russia in June of 1941. Now, granted, a full American division is much bigger than a German division, and partly that's because we had a greater tail-to-teeth ratio. For those who are not familiar with the term, American forces at the front need a much longer, much more sophisticated support mechanism. We can't go to war without our Hershey bars and cigarettes and cold beer and all those good things. That's one of the reasons why there was so much resentment in Britain to the Americans who were overpaid, oversexed, and over here, because we had cold beer and cigarettes. So given all of that, it is true that the American mobilization level was less as a percentage than those, partly because ours was so much greater to start with, but also because the war did not, and thank God, take place on our soil. Why does Germany mobilize such a huge percentage of its resources? That's where the war is. The British could not have survived with any less mobilization than that. So
you mentioned Americans' need of cigarettes and Hershey bars. Well, did the ability of the British naval officers to drink whiskey on board ships give them a competitive edge?
They thought so.
Yeah.
And some Americans thought so as well. One of the things the landing craft tank drivers and the LST captains would take their ships up onto the beach and what they called dry out. Drying out meant you went up at the high tide cycle, and Omaha and Utah beaches have a very gradual slope. There's 1 foot of vertical fall for 50 feet of horizontal space. So it's and 30-foot tides. So if you drive your ship up onto the beach at the high tide mark and open your cupboard doors and the tanks start, meanwhile, while all that's happening, the tide goes out, there's your ship sitting high and dry. You could walk all the way around it, right? Not get your feet wet. So we have to wait till the next high tide cycle. Well, the Americans on board would look around to see if there are any British ships nearby. Because, if you went on a British ship, they'd say, "Oh, welcome, mate, come on in and have a spot of scotch." And pour them a glass full. Rum was what they really mostly had. So the British did have that tradition that the Americans did not, and the Americans tried to take advantage of it whenever they could. It was also a great trading commodity. Off the beach, trading, what do you need? We need bullets. What do you got? We got any rum? We can trade. And so there was a lot of that went on, too.
What were the French thinking when the British and the Americans were deciding how their country was going to be liberated, perhaps?
Well, when you say the French, you're talking several
Yes,
constituencies,
that's very
of
true.
course. There's the French resistance, who made a genuine and significant contribution, gathering soil samples, passing on intelligence, cutting telegraph wires the night before, blowing up train trestles, doing a lot of really good work. There is, of course, the Free French government in exile, self-styled by General de Gaulle, who was absolutely unbearable. I mean, absolutely unbearable as a personality, because he was determined that France was absolutely an equal ally. And Churchill, almost punched him a couple of times. And then the Americans would defend him. No, now we need to keep him. And then he'd irritate an American, and Churchill would say, now we need him around. So there are several constituencies conflicting with one another, and probably the most desperate moment was when the Allies invaded northern France. And they thought they had an understanding with a general named Giraud, who was going to be the stand-in for the Free French. And Giraud said, well, I will accept that position only if I command all Allied forces, British and American as well as French. Well, Eisenhower says, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm the Allied commander. And this guy said, well, then I will not participate, and I will not let anyone else participate. And there's a wonderful memo that Eisenhower sends to Marshall, his mentor, back in Washington, in which he refers to those damned frogs. That's the one moment he let that political mask slip. In the end, Eisenhower ended up making a deal with a French admiral named Darlan, but Darlan turns out to have been a Nazi collaborator, so that got messy. So there was several French constituencies, and figuring out which one you wanted to work with was the difficulty.
Another interesting story you mentioned in here, just as an aside really, but it was interesting, was talking about command, that the LCT and LCVP, the Higginboats commanders, had command over the land generals while they were on the boats.
Correct.
And there was a little bit of friction there sometimes.
Well, that's a protocol that was established even before the war and reinforced during the war, and that is that when troops are embarked on a Navy ship, the Navy commander is in charge. He's the CO. And if you've got a 4-star general embarked and you're a lieutenant junior grade, you can give him orders. Now, it didn't happen very often. Lieutenant junior grades tend to be rather circumspect under those circumstances. Having been one, I can tell you. But it did occasionally happen. Going to the beach, for example, on the early afternoon of D-Day, 6th of June, there was a general, 3-star general on board who was telling the JG, driving the LCT, put in over there. And he said, General, I'm in command until we hit the beach, and then you're in charge. And he thought this guy was going to haul off and slug me. Nope, you're right, Lieutenant, that's true. Carry on. So
Good thing it
he
wasn't
knew
Doug
the role.
MacArthur, huh?
Yeah, well, that's true too.
Or Patton.
Yeah.
I'm going to just get ourselves back into the 19th century for a second here. You
Okay.
give a fascinating comparison between Britain's World War losses and those in America's Civil War. What did you make of that?
Well, I did that deliberately, and I wanted to put that in because Americans think of World War I, where we lost 50-some thousand. Not that that's an inconsiderable number, but as a percentage of our population, it's relatively modest, and certainly compared with the British, where with a much smaller population suffered far greater casualties. As in the Second World War, the British went to war in 1914 and fought in those horrible battles in 1915 along the Somme, at Ypres and Verdun and Passchendaele, in ways the Americans did not. By the time the Americans got actively into the war had already resumed some mobility, so it was a different circumstance. And when we lived in Britain, and I taught at the British Naval Academy for a year, we noticed how on Armistice Day, as they still call it, remember Veterans Day, which we call it now, the 11th of November, everyone in the country wears the poppy. Mm-hmm. Everyone in the country. And they stop at 11 o'clock. The whole country stops at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, the 11th hour, when the war stopped. They stop. And they remember it, as we did this morning for 9/11. Yeah. And the impact of that on their attitude. How quickly now do you want to get back into this war and fight another Passchendaele, fight another Ypres? Not eager to do that. The Americans didn't have that experience. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the ways I wanted to make that comparison is that the percentage of losses, which is between 2 and 2.2% of the entire population, is roughly close, is not exactly the same, but it's equivalent for British losses in World War I and American losses, North and South combined, in the Civil War. So the cultural and social impact the Civil War had on us in the 19th century is roughly akin to what World War I had on the British in the middle of the 20th century. So when we think about British reluctance to charge back into that continent, there's some understanding.